Dr. Jordan Peterson recently sat down with Dr. Kevin Roberts, who is the president of the Heritage Foundation, which here in the States is a massive conservative think tank that practically has influence all across the country. And when a conservative administration gets in, it's one of the more powerful voices in the cabinet with the president. They're able to put their advisors there and things of that sort. So their influence cannot be overstated. But in this interview, I think that Dr. Peterson and Dr. Roberts, who are two very intelligent men, who I think make a lot of great points in this interview on a lot of different matters, I think they get two matters in particularly wrong. Number one, the matter of individualism, and especially number two, which they talk about much more at greater length, the matter of the free market. Now I'm going to give commentary on clips that I'm going to put in this video to show you their arguments so that they are being stated in as pure a fashion as possible. But I'm also going to respond to some of their arguments as well. So allow me to start with the individualism debate. So Dr. Peterson essentially says that he thinks a radical emphasis on the individual has stoked hedonism, meaning he believes it has stoked a mindset and a lifestyle where pleasure is the highest pursuit, the highest good, and everything else is either irrelevant or not as important as pleasure. Now, hedonism is an ancient philosophy. A lot of people in academia will trace back to Jeremy Bentham, who developed the hedonistic calculus of criminality, which a lot of criminologists use to determine why do criminals actually commit the crimes they commit. But Bentham was also a big progenitor of this idea of utilitarianism, which is a philosophical system that basically says that an effect that maximizes the greatest good for the greatest number of people is the morally correct effect. You may recognize utilitarianism in one of its more odious and popular forms known as democracy, but that's a different video, different day. If you have not seen my video, Why Democracy is Evil, it would be in the link down below. I would encourage you all to watch that because it's a really good primer on why the political manifestation of utilitarianism, at least one of them, is quite dangerous. But so let's actually listen to Dr. Peterson's argument here, and then I'll respond to the other side.
And ultimately, to sum up here, I think one of the problems with radical leftism is that this radical emphasis on the individual creates a radical emphasis on the individual's feelings.
Okay, so let's delve into that a little bit too, because the thing is that radical emphasis on the individual is predicated on a very strange acceptance of what constitutes the individual. Because what you see with the hedonistic radicals is their insistence that their immediate emotional or motivational whim defines their individuality, right? I want what I want right now, and no one has any right to stand in my way. Now, the problem with that is that it's a pretty low order conception of what it means to be an individual. It's also extremely immature, and I can speak about that technically. So the more immature you are, the more you are ruled by motivations that want to attain gratification right now, regardless of medium to long-term cost. And so actually what happens is that as you mature and you learn to, quote, delay gratification, which is an oversimplification, you learn to subordinate the demands of immediate motivational and emotional states to long-term social harmony and your own long-term well-being. And that requires a sacrifice of that immediate gratification. So one of the weird things about the left is that the individual who they make sacrosanct is an individual defined by his or her subjugation to their own hedonic motivations. And that's a pretty low order conceptualization of the self, right? And so I don't see it as a true individuality as well.
So there are some points to make here that I think are very important. Number one, Dr. Peterson never really defines individualism. I think whenever you want to endeavor to talk about a concept, it does you and the audience who is receiving your words about that concept and that topic to actually define what that concept means. I'll endeavor at an explanation in a second, but this is less about me and more about the arguments we are seeing presented in this show. Number two, Dr. Peterson, as you even saw, admits that the version of individualism, so-called, that puts hedonism at the forefront, actually isn't real individualism. I'm happy he made that concession, but the way he was talking about that concept for a few minutes before that concession made it seem as if he was indicating individualism at large, or at least radical individualism at large, as bearing a specimen of this sort that prides pleasure over every single thing else. But I also want to understand, he was talking about individualism in the context of the left-wing worldview. Now, left-wing worldview is a very, 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 very broad statement that a lot of people may even say, well, Christian, you need to define that. But if we look at the left-wing worldview for what it is, I see it as two axes on different sides of a map. Think of the North Pole and the South Pole. North Pole and the South Pole, they're both cold, they're both frigid, you'll die there without any proper protection. But they are ultimately on the other side of the world. So, one pole of leftist thought is class-based thinking. And this thought was endemic to the old left. The old left was the faction of the left in the West that emerged out of Marxist discourses about class, status, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, the material conditions of man, that kind of thing. But it also emerged out of the Hegelianism of Germany. And the Hegelianism of Germany influenced how the government there under Otto von Bismarck was ran. And those Bismarckian ideas eventually engaged in a transatlantic transfer and came all the way over to America. And they were seen as divine ideas in the minds and hearts of so many progressive era reformers in the country. Woodrow Wilson and several others who were also under his tutelage as social scientists who happened to develop entire systems in America. Whether it be education, whether it be the permanent administrative state, and so on and so forth, whether it be environmental protections or workplace regulations, the banning of child labor, all that kind of stuff. A lot of that stuff came from this idea that the centralizing force in society has to be a top-down state, a top-down government. And that is because there are broader ideas, abstract ideas, like egalitarianism, that we have to actualize upon the earth through force. This is soft Hegelianism. Obviously, Hegelianism is much more deep and much more substantive than just that. But the progressive era reformers are engaging in a sense of soft Hegelianism. So that really was the old left in America. They were still concerned about the downtrodden worker. They were still concerned about the middle class and things about that. There was still this dichotomy between the rich and the poor. There was this antipathy towards people like Rockefeller and they called them robber barons in that era. And there was government action taken against those people. Now, regardless of the truth of all that historiography, because we understand that progressive historiography is actually one of the most malignant forces in the history of documenting events. It's absolutely malignant. And a lot of it's false. In fact, there's actually a good book, Constitutional Conservatism During the Progressive Era, which actually documents how progressive historians have distorted the progressive era to make it romantic in the eyes of Americans. I encourage all of you to read it. It'll be also in the links down below. So that was the old left view. This class-based, status-based view of man, imported from the old world that manifested in America and across the West. The new left view that came after the 1960s viewed man in a similar way, but as opposed to material class being the designation that set him apart in the eyes of these performers, it was identity. It was their class as a woman, as a gay person, as whatever, as a disabled person. And this is where intersectionality comes in. And so these are two very distinct views of man that use the same model, i.e. the collective group-based view of man, but have different forms, i.e. one being based on class and material conditions, one being based on social conditions and identity that they arbitrarily assign value to. And both of these views of man, neither of them imply the individual. And it is wrong for Jordan Peterson to try to say, although I understand why he says it, that this radical individualist leftism is actually properly called, even improperly called, individualism. It's not. It's absolutely not, because the key tenet of both the old left worldview and the new left worldview is a rejection of the concrete reality of the individual and replacing him for an abstraction that they can then use to justify their tyrannical policies, because they're not actually, in their view, treading on the individual. What they're actually doing is they're helping people in society by building up the common good through state action. Now, some may say, well, Christian, what about the phenomenon of my truth and the sort of standpoint epistemology, the sort of subjective worldview that so many people on the left have? Is that not an individualism? Of course it's not. Because what it does is it tells you to think of your experience in light of your identity, which ultimately divorces the individual from the consideration. Because the moment the person that believes in the intersectional oppressive maxim says, I'm an individual and my life should be based on that basis, they no longer are able to partake in the maxim because their humanity has now transcended the narrow terms of the method, the intersectional method. So under no instance is leftism at all friendly towards individualism. There's just no instance. Perhaps there's some weird new age spiritual version of progressivism that might be, but not mainstream leftism, not in mainstream leftist thought. Okay, but that's a different matter. Let's now talk about their discourse on the free market. So this part actually kind of surprised me because Dr. Peterson and Dr. Roberts are very smart men, but a lot of their arguments were caricatures that I have heard time and time again that bear some truth, but ultimately miss the crux of the matter in the situation. So let us play Dr. Peterson's assessment here of the free market.
So the first comment in question, I suppose, is one on the strategic front. So I think the conservative movement has weakened its argument for the decentralization of power by aligning that argument too closely with libertarian, neocon, and free market principles, because it often devolves into a proclamation that a government that's too large is too dangerous, which I do believe, but that's not the crucial issue as far as I'm concerned, that if the government was smaller, the tax burden would be less. If the tax burden would be less, that would be better because people should be economically free, and they should be economically free because, well, because the society functions better when the free market is as untrammeled as possible. And so it's kind of in some ways, it's an Ayn Rand philosophy of, rugged individualism conjoined with libertarian admiration for the free market. Now, there are some problems with that. One you pointed to, and we'll get back to that later, I think, when we discuss neoconservatism. One is that the free market itself is probably not the only basis for an equitable and just and moral polity. It's not the thing that's at the bottom. And I think that's where the libertarian types have it wrong. And I think there are good reasons for that. But more importantly, there is a better reason to discuss the necessity of devolving power down the hierarchy to lower levels. The first thing I would say is it's not power. When we shouldn't use that language because that's the language the leftists use.
So this is a very interesting distinction here. So let's start with his first formulation, that neoconservatism, libertarianism, and free market ideology, in his words, are the sort of trifecta of forces that have demeaned conservative arguments against the centralization of authority. So I think that the first error here, and I'm not being pedantic, this is just as a matter of consistency, the first error here is trying to group two similar concepts, libertarian philosophy and free marketism or whatever. And by the way, we'll talk about that in a second. I don't think there's such thing as a free marketism. We'll talk about that in a second. And something completely different, neoconservatism. Neoconservatism literally calls for so many of the things that rebel against the free market principles. Neoconservatism literally calls for a massive standing army, which is inherently a threat to liberty in times of peace. It inherently calls for foreign interventionism abroad, which destabilizes global markets and causes there to be all kind of chaos. War is not good for profit. War is not good for creativity. War is simply the systematic waste of human energy and dumping it into the massive garbage disposal that is the dead end of conflict. It calls for so many things that are ultimately antithetical to the ends of the free market. So we should understand that before grouping them together as if they're some kind of best buddies on the baseball field playing ball together. Yeah, that's not the case whatsoever. But also we should understand this. I don't think it's a terrible interpretation of the libertarian position to say that the free market is the basis of society. In fact, and by the way, when I was in college, not long ago, I was actually very much libertarian. I don't call myself that anymore. I am decidedly an American constitutionalist conservative with heavy classical liberal leanings. I think that term gives more definition and more meat than just saying, oh, I'm a libertarian or whatever. Because libertarianism ultimately can mean anything to anyone. And it's also just a bare minimum. Okay, you believe that liberty is important? Great, so do I. But there are so many libertarians, because they have this transfixation on power, and Peterson's right here in its sense. They have this transfixation on power. They cannot address the other domains of society because their minds are focused entirely on the government, on the bad actors in the government, on the shadowy forces in the government, and how they try to manipulate the world. This extreme worldview actually kind of gets to the point of denying man's agency, denying his free will, denying his ability to influence the world through rational and dedicated action, through habituation, because it will say, and this is not all libertarians, but this is some, it will say there are forces at the upper echelons of government that are much stronger than you, much powerful than you, who have much more control than you on an institutional and cultural level. Therefore, anything you do is useless. It's a philosophy of applied political nihilism that I don't endorse. And I saw that immensely in the libertarian world. It's one of the reasons why I had to get away. I had to. Because I can't live around some people, not everybody, but some people who are so dedicated to the idea that man is hopeless in the face of a Leviathan. Man is hopeless in the face of a behemoth of authority. That it's all about power. No, it's not. There's more to the domain of society and man and politics than power. So Peterson's right in saying that power is not what we should be talking about. But what he's wrong in saying is that libertarians believe that the free market is the basis of society. They don't. The most charitable libertarian interpretation of the basis of society would undoubtedly be voluntary cooperation amongst individuals. And if you go back to the natural law tradition, to people like Hugo Grotius, who's one of my favorite philosophers, they will interpret this phenomenon of voluntary cooperation between individuals as sociability, as the inherent social sense that man has by virtue of being a human being, applied to communities, applied to him going into society to preserve himself and to follow his interests. Now, Peterson calls this also Ayn Rand. And I think that, again, this is another caricature. Ayn Rand was creating a broader system of philosophy, a worldview that encompasses everything from economics to politics to aesthetics to epistemology, a broad worldview that goes far beyond free market capitalism. And I also want to say something else as well. Ayn Rand was not an original thinker when it came to economics. Ayn Rand was taking heed of thinkers before like Mises and Friedrich von Hayek and people like that. She was not an original thinker in economics. So to give her the credit for the development of the free market principles is absolutely nonsense. The ideas of the free market are downstream of the idea of voluntary cooperation. And the idea of voluntary cooperation is downstream of the ancient, not the 20th century, but the 17th century idea of sociability that natural law theorists like Grotius, like Pufendorf, like Emer de Vital, like Lord Keynes, who all came before John Locke or were contemporaries of John Locke, by the way. It's downstream of that principle of sociability, which says that man has a social sense inside of himself that drives him into community so that he can preserve himself and at the same time pursue his interests with others. It recognizes that man's not an atomized individual, as so many people will say the free market stokes, but man is an individual in the context of a society that he chooses as virtue of his conscience to move in or not to move in. That's all. And to deny this is to deny a basic human instinct and principle that also throws into question, if you deny that, your view of human nature. If you don't believe in free will, if you don't believe that man has this drive to take himself into places to help him benefit himself, but also act in a way that may also benefit others, if you don't believe that man can, through rational action, habituate something greater than himself, then you can't be a conservative. You can't be anything remotely approaching someone who has a good conception of the human being. You might as well be a Rousseauian. You might as well be a progressive. You might as well be someone who says that man is built by social by social institutions. He's a product of social institutions, and that is his portion in life. Now, there is a conservative view to this. You'll see a lot of the traditionalist Catholics, so to speak, that are very popular in the American right. A lot of them will default to Aristotle, who in his book, The Politics, in Nicomachean Ethics especially, he notes that man needs community to pursue virtue. And for Aristotle, virtue is this process of habituation that allows you to reach your fullest potential, eudaimonia, which is sometimes improperly translated as happiness. And so what the traditionalist conservative will say is that the common good actually helps man achieve the highest version of himself. And without the common good, man can't do that. He'll have a life of despair and degeneracy and decadence. And this is a viewpoint that I think is overstated. It's true that virtue does happen in a social context, but it's not true that my development, my potential, is determined by another man's goodwill. That's not true. Because if that's true, it discounts the role that I must play in the pursuit of my own standard of value. So that's just a side point for another day. But so it's improper to say that this is an Ayn Rand conception when Ayn Rand's basis for reality, if you believe her followers and her writings, was that reality is knowable by man who can apply his reason to these objective principles. It's not the free market. The free market actually has a subsidiary position in Ayn Rand's philosophy. And by the way, I'm not an objectivist whatsoever. I think that objectivism is not my thing. They have some good insights, but ultimately I think that some of their views, like on love and aesthetics, are just leaves much to be desired. Much to be desired. But let's go on to what Dr. Kevin Roberts said in response to Peterson's comment.
It's meaning and responsibility. And those things are aligned. And so what happens, and I've really found this idea striking a chord with audiences that I've talked around the world, is that if you deprive people of local responsibility, you deprive them of all the meaning in their life. Because the meaning in their life is actually a consequence of taking responsibility for themselves, taking responsibility for their marriage, for their family, for their local community, for their business enterprises, for their town, for their state, for their country, in that order, right? And then maybe to God. And responsibility obtains at every one of those levels. That's the subsidiarity idea, of course. But the purpose for that is that if you devolve that responsibility down the hierarchy, you reinstill the meaning in people's lives, the meaning that sustains them through catastrophe. And so, because you got to ask, well, why should the typical young person listen to a conservative who says, well, you should take more local responsibility? Because it sounds like a lot of work, a lot of duty, and something that's not particularly hedonically gratifying. But if the answer is, well, if you forego that responsibility, you have nothing to sustain you when you suffer, and you forego the possibility of formulating the extremely tight and reciprocal social interactions that buttress you through life, and you deprive your life of intrinsic meaning, then that seems like a very bad idea for you. And I've found it's very striking everywhere I've gone to talk. If I make that connection between responsibility and meaning, the audiences fall completely silent. It always happens because no one, we haven't had a good discussion about the relationship between meaning and responsibility in the West for like 60 years, right? Since the mid-60s.
It's been a long time.
It's been a very long time. People assume that there's no meaning outside of a kind of a narrow hedonism, or that there's no meaning at all. And that's a very dismal set of propositions. And it is a weak place in the progressive enterprise, because sustaining meaning is found in responsibility and really in self-sacrifice, or at least the sacrifice of the narrow self. Now, this insistence that your enterprise has on this subsidiary vision, is that grounded at least in part in Catholic social doctrine? Because that principle of subsidiarity, it is. Okay. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. And the Heritage Foundation's non-sectarian, but we're animated by the Judeo-Christian intellectual tradition. And as we discussed earlier in reference to education, I'm Roman Catholic, but the effect of subsidiarity on Heritage's mission, of course, long predates me. We've been around 50 years, and it's just because it's a vital part of our Western intellectual tradition, as you explained so well. And I think it's an excellent way, given the conversations on the political right now, to talk about the issues we're discussing here about meaning and responsibility. It's related very much to something that has become more common parlance in conservative circles, which is to say that the reason we want a more limited government isn't because of some doctrinaire belief that the free market is always better than government. That's not the case. It's because there is an inherent dignity that comes from work, or put more broadly, there's a dignity that comes from responsibility, and therefore we have greater meaning. It's no surprise to me that you've gotten that wonderful response in all of those talks when you emphasize those points, because people not only know that that's true, just intuitively, right? Naturally. The second thing, to come back to my constructive criticism of free marketism, conservatives, myself included years ago, have done a very poor job of taking advantage of that great vulnerability of the political left that you identified, which is this very issue, because our response to that for 20 or 25 years was, well, the free market will take care of it. Pull yourself up from your bootstraps. Read Ayn Rand. It's all going to be okay. Just work a little bit harder. Well, in reality, that isn't true in the first place, but this is really key. It's especially not been true since the mid-1960s with the ill-named war on poverty, because what that has done is actually eradicate for 2 generations of Americans the meaning and responsibility that every human person should have. Therefore, in order for, just to kind of swerve into the sidewalk level, as I like to say, if conservatives are going to succeed in safety net reform and so-called welfare reform, we first have to get better at talking about the limitations of the free market and the necessity of conservative principles, conservative political dogma, to be associated with our long tradition of living in community, which actually has a longer history in conservatism than even free market principles.
So let's talk about this. This is a very important point. You will oftentimes hear people in the conservative movement say that for X amount of years, we have all been free market ideologues. Now, this is not entirely true, because there's a lot of variation in the conservative movement. It is true that during the Reagan era, and in the preceding years before the Reagan era, there was Barry Goldwater, and Barry Goldwater was a very strong progenitor and expositor of free market principles. There was William F. Buckley, who was also a very strong expositor of free market principles. Then there was Reagan, who was also, in a lot of his rhetoric and in some of his policies, was a very strong expositor of free market principles. But beneath that, there was a wealth of thought on a bunch of different systems, including people like Brent Bozell Sr., who was a Catholic, I won't say extremist, he was a Catholic radical conservative, who had as much skepticism of the free market as these guys do, or perhaps even more, actually. There was a bunch of people that were in the magazines of conservative intelligentsia trying to direct the narrative towards a different point. So it wasn't just entirely this blanket praise of Ayn Rand. In fact, if you go back and watch the debate that Christopher Hitchens had with Henry Binswanger and a few of the major Ayn Rand intellectuals, you will quickly see it becomes apparent that the Ayn Rand people and Ayn Rand intelligentsia had no love for Reagan, had no love for conservatism. In fact, Binswanger says explicitly, we are not Reagan conservatives. We don't care about the family.
As to the family being altruistic, I don't belong to a family. We are not Reagan conservatives. We do not stand up here and champion family. We champion the individual. I would like to find someone I can marry. I don't plan to have children. And if I have someone that I love, whom I marry, it won't be someone who joins with me on the basis of from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. It will be trading value for value, both economically and in terms of spiritual values.
So this idea that you can just say we had an economic intuition and that leads to Ayn Rand because she had the same intuition is the worst kind of association fallacy I have seen when it comes to proper political thinking, because it's just not true. Ayn Rand had a totally different basis in metaphysics for her view. of the world than Reagan did, than Goldwater did, than Buckley did. Buckley had a fight with her because he didn't like the Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged, one of them. He had a fight with her. And she said, Mr. Buckley, you are far too intelligent to believe in God. And they had a falling out. So this is only superficially plausible, this connection with Ayn Rand and the conservative movement. It's not. It's superficially plausible. But let's go to the deeper point here about meaning and responsibility. It's fine to say that the free market does not work unless people are willing to be responsible. Fine. But how do you instill responsibility into someone, number one? And number two, is the process of instilling responsibility into someone a matter for political order or a matter for personal self-governance? If you answer that it is a matter for personal self-governance, then in no political philosophy should the idea of instilling responsibility be a debate. Political philosophy, in its strictest sense, is the principles and rules that guide the application of power to particular circumstances, that is politics. But if you believe, as many common good conservatives do, that the application of power should be used in areas where personal self-governance is the preferred method of doing things, then the application of power has no limits. And not only do you lapse into tyranny, you lapse into a epistemological confusion about the proper scope of social issues in their context with politics. If you think, for example, that, let's just give any issue here. If you think, for example, that pornography is a political issue, you have a confusion about proper political order and personal self-governance. If you think that alcoholism is a political issue, you have a confusion about proper political order and personal self-governance. Those two concepts have been made political issues by people whose personal tastes and sensibilities have been confused with the actual science of using politics. And they have then, by confusing and corrupting the science of politics, tried to enforce their worldview upon others in a way that doesn't actually create sustained virtue and doesn't actually create the effect they claim that they want, but simply creates resentment and creates, at best, a short-term subservience to the diktats of the moralist in power, and at worst, a revolt by defaulting to illicit means to obtain what they cannot obtain otherwise in common society because of the oppressive political order that has bear down upon them. In other words, you don't create virtue through government. You don't create virtue through political order. You create virtue through freedom. Virtue is a product of freedom, if you follow the definitions and the principles and the ideas to the correct extent. So I have no problem saying that yes, the conservative movement has spent some time not talking as much about the personal, but in a sense they have. Even during the 80s and the 90s, look at the moral majority. Look at a bunch of different social movements that came out and spoke about the personal all the time. The personal has not been neglected, but the personal has not been the object of political discourse. Because the moment the political and the personal become blended and become one and the same, what happens is personal grievances get confused and placed above first principles. And government gets off track. And society becomes a playpen for whatever maniac managed to get in power with his own personal grievances. This is the reason why the personal as the political is one of the most dangerous concepts in Western political thought, because it reduces politics to a power game and reduces society also to a power struggle, and then puts emphasis on whoever can win that struggle in line with their identity. And so these are just the 2 points I wanted to respond to. There's more in this interview where they go on to say that you have to have trust in the society for the free market to work, and they're continually skeptical of the free market, which, by the way, that's their right. But ultimately, I don't agree. I think the free market is one of the greatest progenitors of human progress known to man. And it's not because the free market has produced the most materially bountiful consequences and statistics, which like many people say, people will say that capitalism is the greatest engine to people out of poverty. And that's true, but that's not why it's good. Because material consequences don't define the good. They're a product of it, but they don't define it. The free market is good because it assumes several anti-materialistic principles in its formation that buttress and enforce what it means to be a human. The free market assumes free will, which is what voluntary association and trade are. The free market assumes a freedom of conscience to enter into your own transactions under your own risk and under your own will. And the free market also, and this is most importantly, assumes a sense of contractual responsibility amongst people, so much so that their fates in that transaction are linked together at pain of penalty if that is violated by either party. These are spiritual principles that go beyond simply economics and cut deeper to what it means to be a human being. And that's what America is founded off of. What does it mean to be an American ultimately is going to mean what it means to have certain facets of your human nature interact with political order. That's why the free market is so powerful. Not because it's the foundation of anything. It's not the foundation of anything. It is the result of a strong understanding of human nature. It's not antithetical to community. It's not against responsibility or meaning, just the opposite. It's an engine of all of these moral concepts put into place that was juxtaposed by the conservative movement against the Soviet Union and the old world social order of those regimes and happened to win out in history. Even though there are still communists walking this earth, even though some regimes on this earth are still communist, on balance, it has won out. And the conservative movement would do best not to retreat from these principles just because some people in their movement have been strategically inept to focus only on these principles with a kind of myopia, and in doing so, ignore the deeper personal needs that man has, which, by the way, are not political considerations. They are personal considerations. I promised I would define individualism. And the best understanding of individualism I've had from all my study is this. Individualism is the condition that a man reaches after he understands the truth about his own nature, how his human nature interacts with reality and the world, and when he asserts his context, his conscience, in the context of this understanding against the ravages of the mob. Individualism is man embracing his inherent reason, embracing his conscience, and putting those two things over the mob. That's what it is. It's a response to a world that wishes to take you from your conscience, take you from your reason, and take you from your human nature. It's not atomism. It's not antisocial. It is an affirmation of what it actually means to be a self-determined person in this world. That's the best understanding I have of it. And I think that we should all approach these ideas with better understanding if we're going to actually win this fight for the West. There are a lot of forces that wish to tear down the West. There's the post-liberals, there's the radical Islamists, there's the communists, there's the woke folks, there's all kind of people that wish to destroy Western civilization and wish to destroy the American Republic. And the best bulwark we have against those people is understanding the concepts that have made the West great, that have made America great, and that these people happen to revile in their rhetoric and their apologies for tyranny. My friends, if you like this video and you want to support me financially, please be sure to donate on Patreon, Locals, PayPal, anywhere you can. Locals is the best place to donate. ChristianWatson.locals.com. Let us build up that community so we can have good conversations internally and we can also keep this thing going. If you want to help support my channel, leaving a like is the best thing you can do. Please like this video so the algorithm recommends it. Leave a like, please. If you don't leave a like, then just comment. Or you can do both. Leave a like and comment. And if you want to go the extra mile, just take the link, copy and paste it, and share somewhere. That also helps me as well. My friends, love you guys so much. Study history, study philosophy, stay morally convicted, and most importantly, my friends, you better stay pensive. Bye, everyone.